So let me briefly introduce our speakers, and I do believe their longer bios are on the Georgetown Law Center website, if I'm not incorrect, but they're also very easy to find in any search engine, and I'm not going to mention any particular search engine, but look them up, because they're all terrific folks, and I feel very, very lucky to be able to bring together this panel. So directly to my right, we have Rebecca Hansen, who's the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Policy for Sinclair Broadcast Group. Eddie Lazarus, Executive Vice President and General Counsel for Tribune Corporation. So, by the way, this is a big deal to have the two representatives of the merging parties. So I called it in chit with both of them, so thank you, guys. Then we have Carmen Scarrato, who's the Director for Policy and Legal Affairs of the National Hispanic Media Coalition. And then directly to her right is Jim Winston, the President of the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters. At his right is my mentor and a longtime friend and sometimes pain in the whatever, Andy Schwartzman, who's a Benton Senior Counselor and an attorney at the Georgetown Institute for Public Representation. So welcome, everybody. I think the first question I want to ask, so we had two very stark visions there, right? One vision was of an industry that gets a lot of government and taxpayer benefits and therefore owes something to the public, a fiduciary. And one of the things they owe is a diversity of voices. On the other hand, we have a scrappy competitor in a very competitive marketplace, and where the free market, according to Jerry Fritz, ought to rule. Okay, whatever needs to be done to make sure that broadcasters survive needs to be done. It's kind of the way I read what Jerry was talking about. So I thought I would ask anybody in the panel if they wanted to respond. Which is it, or is it a little bit of both? Rebecca, sure.
First. Yeah, David paints a very rosy picture, and a lot of the points he makes are not disputable, except that we got our spectrum for free. If that's the case, I'm going to be expecting a $4.4 billion check back from Eddie at some point, in addition to the $85 billion that our company has paid over the years in acquisitions that we've made. So there is an investment in spectrum, regardless of how, as Jerry pointed out, the origin of how the original licenses were issued. But the other part of the picture that David painted is what you see before you, and it's basically the environment in which we try to use these so-called government benefits to create a self-sustaining, financially solid ability to deliver local news. This is a slide showing where broadcasters are in the middle in the media ecosystem in which we have to work. We have networks from whom we buy programming, 50, 60 times our size, and MVPDs where we distribute our programming. To summarize where we are in this landscape, the major challenges in which we're supposed to provide all these public benefits include major declines in our primary revenue source, which is local advertising, major consolidation of satellite and cable companies with nationwide or near nationwide footprints, consolidation of national programming networks, increased costs of programming, including sports, fragmentation of our viewership, and entry of massive competitors such as Apple, Google, Netflix, and Facebook. So I wanted to lay that out to set the scene that it's not as black and white as David presented it. And I'll just stop there for a second.
Andy, you want to respond?
Yeah. Let's talk about our spectrum. We own the spectrum. The public owns the spectrum. We are the landlords. They are the tenants. Sinclair doesn't own spectrum. When Rebecca says our spectrum, that's not so. What Sinclair bought was licenses. They're licenses for 8 years, which expire, and they have a right to a renewal if they earn it. Unfortunately, the FCC rubber stamps that, but they're supposed to earn it with public service. But make no mistake about it, we own the spectrum. And you need to view it in that context when you realize that what we are saying is that because we, the public, own the spectrum, we can set appropriate conditions to make sure that that spectrum is used to benefit the public. and that includes ensuring competition and diversity. So when Jerry says, oh, well, antitrust can take care of it, antitrust law is about competition. The Communications Act is about diversity, and diversity is ultimately the most important thing that we're trying to get here. So when I hear this, it's our spectrum, it just really, really, really turns me upside down. We own it, they don't.
Okay, Eddie, and then David, and then I want to move on to another topic.
Well, there's an awful lot to be said on this one, but just
Turn on your mic.
Oh, sorry. Is it on now? Thank you. I'm not sure it's really that fruitful a discussion to talk about who owns the spectrum in quite the way we are. I think all local broadcasters feel obligations to their communities. That's what sets local broadcasters apart. But the trade that David described is just not accurate. There's no requirement that local broadcasters provide local news. Many local broadcasters, some of the biggest, the religious broadcasters, ION, many local broadcasters don't provide local news, and the reason they don't is it's hugely expensive. The people who provide local news, and Tribune provides as much or more than most, it's because it's a differentiator. It's because they live in these communities, they want to serve the communities, and if they can afford it, they invest deeply in local news, they invest deeply in local sports, they invest deeply in their anchors and their relationships with the communities. But to do that, it's not a government requirement. That's something you do because you think it is the right way to run your business. And both Sinclair and Tribune have run their businesses that way. David, one other small point. David talks about the fact that in its biggest markets, Tribune puts on more local news than Sinclair does in its local markets. But there's actually a very simple explanation for at least a good part of that, which is our biggest markets, New York, Chicago, and L.A., we have either CW affiliates or independents. You run local news on those because you're not required by your network partner to have Good Morning America or the Today Show or what they put on and require you to put on when you're a network affiliate. Whereas Sinclair, most of their biggest stations are network affiliates, and therefore they're required in many circumstances to run network programming. Both companies are deeply, deeply devoted to local news. And the reason for that is that's our way of delivering value to consumers. And David said one other thing, which I'll just point out, which is that we get automatic distribution. It is true that local broadcasters can choose what's called must-carry to get local distribution. But that's not what Sinclair and Tribune and most of the major broadcasters do. They choose retransmission consent where the free market is involved, where you negotiate with the cable and satellite providers for carriage. You don't get automatic carriage. So the structure of the marketplace is just very different than what's been described here.
And I would just,
So,
can I
yeah,
jump
just
in
very
on that?
quickly.
Very quickly. Eddie makes a very important point about retrans, because in some of our smaller markets, we have award-winning newscasts that do an excellent job year after year, but the ad revenue in those small markets is not enough. So those newscasts are not profitable. So if it weren't for retrans, we couldn't be delivering the very thing that David wants us to deliver.
Let me just stop here. We have a national audience. It's not just the wonks in D.C. So
Right.
when you say retrans and retransmission consent, could you, one of the two of you, Rebecca, since you've got the mic, or Eddie, just explain to people what that is?
So as a broadcaster, there are two ways that you could get distribution on the main distribution platforms. Now, one, you send out your signal over the air, and people can get that for free. But if you're subscribing to cable or satellite, that happens in one of two ways. Either you choose something called must carry, which means that the cable and satellite people don't pay you anything for your signal, but they do have to carry it. Or you choose what's called retransmission consent, which is you're going to pay me for the consent to retransmit my signal. And what happens then is you engage in a negotiation over what the price of that is going to be, and the cable or satellite operator, this is oversimplified, but basically pays the local broadcaster for that signal in that market, and then the local broadcaster, and this is also very important, pays an increasing share of that money back to the network that it's affiliated with. So if it's a CBS affiliate, you're paying it back to CBS. If it's an ABC affiliate, you're paying it back to ABC. And so what's happened in the marketplace today for local broadcast is local broadcast advertising dollars, which are the major driver of revenue at all local broadcasters is flat to down and has been for years because of the increased competition from cable and the internet, Google and Facebook and all the rest of that. Retransmission consent revenue is going up, but the share that the local broadcaster is paying back to the networks is going up faster. And so all local broadcasters feel themselves in a tremendous financial squeeze. And that is what,
that's what that slide is.
That's what that slide is. And that is what drives a mature industry like broadcasting to consolidate, because that drives synergies which allow companies to save money and reinvest that money into the local communities. In the absence of that, there will be no growth in the broadcast industry until there's a technological change in the industry. And that is why you have Rebecca and I sitting up here as members of two separate companies that their shareholders are interested in becoming one company.
So, David, I want you to respond, but I also want you to respond to what Eddie said, because I was quite struck by it, that broadcasters don't have a legal or statutory obligation to serve their local communities. That's not what
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
I said we don't have a requirement to put on local news. That is one way to serve a local community, but there are the vast majority of broadcasters in every DMA in this country do not put on local news. I just want to
Thank you for that
But
clarification.
it doesn't mean they're not serving their local communities. Religious broadcasters do a great job serving their local communities.
Yeah, because my
about
mentor,
local
Andy
content.
Schwartzman, taught me about the statutory needs. So thank you for clarifying it. I'm good. David.
Well, the first thing I'll say is if Sinclair and Tribune are serious about maintaining the level of local coverage and local staffing at Tribune stations, I think they should suggest that that be in writing in any order that the FCC puts out or that the government does in approving this merger. But you're never going to hear them commit to that because, as I said before, if past is prologue, Sinclair buys stations and fires local resources, local reporters, local sportscasters, and moves
Do
it.
you really want the government to dictate to broadcasters what kind of content to put over the air?
I didn't say that.
Just last month, the entire Washington community was up in arms because Chairman Pai didn't come out forcefully enough in favor of the First Amendment so that NBC's licenses wouldn't be in jeopardy. For you to suggest that the government, in an order from the FCC, should direct broadcasters to have any specific type of programming would be just the most constitutionally infirm decision.
Well, you and I both know it would be a negotiated consent decree out of the Department of Justice or anything else, or even how about just a letter? How about a letter from the CEO of Sinclair saying, I will not cut local staff in Chicago, L.A., New York, or any other Tribune property. You will not hear it because it would be a false statement. Now, as for retrans, we know one thing for sure. This company intends to raise prices. Don't take my word for it. Look at the transcript from their investor call where the CEO said, we're going to raise retrans fees. That means you, the American taxpayer, if you subscribe to cable or satellite, your prices will go up. I have worked in Washington, maybe not as long as Jerry, but for 27 years, or Andy, and never have I seen a merging company come to this town and say, please approve our merger, we intend to raise prices. And maybe that's why we have conservatives like Chris Ruddy, who runs Newsmax, and progressives like Andy Schwartzman on the same page agreeing that this merger is bad news. Maybe that's why even under antitrust law, you've got 4 attorneys general from different states, including Sinclair's home state, saying this is a bad merger. I think the raising of prices and the failure to commit to localism is really spelling a bad deal.
Okay, I want to shift gears just a little bit because we haven't heard from either Carmen or Jim, and they've got a lot to say. First, I want to ask whether you have, first, if you have a response to what you've heard for the last 10 minutes. And also, I want to focus, we're talking a lot about money, retransmission consent fees and making a profit. But, obviously, diversity of voices, the concern about diversity of voices affects other things. It affects our electoral process. Okay? It affects whether marginalized communities will get to speak. So I was hoping that, Jim and Carmen, maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your concerns, not only with the change in the ownership rules, but also perhaps with the merger as well, about its impact on voices of color. So Carmen, why don't you start, and then Jim follow.
Absolutely. I had my mic on. Absolutely. And what I've heard a lot of talk about localism, but I haven't heard much talk about diversity and the impact this will have. And we're talking about the marketplace. As it stands, women and people of color lag far behind white men in broadcast ownership. And the number for Latinos is dismally low. It's about 4.5% of broadcast television. And when you're talking about diversity, when you consolidate and make these must-run segments that are centrally produced and distributed to the local stations across the country, you are pushing out and keeping diverse owners out of the market. And not only that, but we just don't have that diversity that our community needs. And specifically, the National Association of Broadcasters actually puts out a study every year. And they said that Latinos disproportionately rely on broadcast media for their news. And 31% of Latinx households rely on broadcast TV solely as their source for news. And the numbers are even higher for Spanish-speaking households. It's 47.7%. So I feel like this consolidation will not serve the diversity of voices that is needed to serve that community.
Jim?
Yes, thank you, Gigi. I feel like I need to give a little bit of history here. As the president of the National Association of Black-Owned Broadcasters, my guess is that very few of the folks in the room may be familiar with this. So I'll go back a little bit. In 1978, the Federal Communications Commission, recognizing the lack of diversity of ownership of broadcasting, particularly among minorities, created a... Oh. I think it's on. Is that better? Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, no. Oh, there we are. There we are. Okay. Created a minority ownership policy, which was designed to increase the ownership of broadcast facilities by African Americans and other minorities. That program worked very well. In 1978, there were 36 African American owned radio stations in America, no African American owned television stations. At its peak, NABOB represented 250 African American owned radio stations and 23 African American owned television stations, which was a huge increase from 1978 to 1995. Unfortunately, that 250 radio stations was out of 11,000 in America, and the 23 television stations were out of 1,400 in America. And since that time, because of congressional and FCC policy changes, our numbers have actually decreased. So now we're at 12 full-power television stations and 180 radio stations. So when you talk about consolidation in the industry, consolidation has already caused a great loss of African American ownership and minority ownership throughout the industry. And as Carmen was saying, minority communities rely upon broadcast radio and television for their news more than the general market. So when we talk about consolidation in industry, it's always a matter of great concern to NABOB, and historically, we have always been a knee-jerk response. No more consolidation. The Sinclair Tribune merger comes at an interesting time for NABOB because recently we have been in conversation with the NAB, and the NAB brought home a really key point for us. And
That's the National Association of Broadcasters.
National Association of Broadcasters.
Let's try not to talk in acronyms if we can help it. It's very hard.
The General Market Association. And what they brought to mind was this market cap chart that you see in back of you. And if you look at the largest television companies, you see that there are a fraction of those companies they have to compete with. So you got Comcast, NBC up there with a huge market cap. You've got AT&T, DirecTV up there. And so if you're a pure broadcaster in 2017, you are competing against companies that are many, many more times your size, not to mention Facebook and Google, all of whom are looking for the advertising dollar. So where we are now at NABOB is we're at a crossroads trying to figure out how do we navigate, how do we, if the broadcast industry as a whole is at a disadvantage, what does that mean for us as African American broadcasters? So when I look at the Sinclair Tribune transaction, I'm hoping that there will be some because there's a discussion that some of the stations that are being acquired by Sinclair may be spun off, and in fact may be spun off to some minority broadcasters. So we're looking at this more in a complex way than we would have previously, and I think it does require that the FCC give it a very hard and close look. and we hope that the kinds of things that Sinclair and Tribune have been talking about in general terms with respect to their merger might result in some actual positive gains in minority ownership.
Yeah, I mean,
So I'd like Rebecca not only to respond to what Carmen and Jim have said, but also just to the general question. This is going to create a broadcast behemoth that nobody's ever seen before. 233 stations, 72% coverage of the American people. Why is it in the public interest?
Well, to respond to what I heard in Carmen's remarks was that there's assuming an underlying causal relationship between the broadcast ownership limits and minority ownership, and that has never been proven to be the case. The only thing that has resulted provably in increased minority ownership was Congress's minority tax credit. And if Congress were to bring that back, I think you would see an increase in minority ownership, because historically that is the only data that's ever proven what causes minority ownership. And Jim, yes, you do correctly point out that to the extent we do plan that we're going to have to spin off some stations. Right now, 20% of potential buyers of those stations are either minority or women owned. It wasn't clear from your ex parte, but you should be aware that, and that's a very strong percentage, and we're very proud of that. I guess going way back to what David said, I really have to take off the table his baseless allegations that when Sinclair buys a station, we sort of go in and fire everyone and run it from Baltimore. That's simply not true. That's a caricature of a narrative that's being spun, and it really clouds the policy debate that should be discussed, which is how do we fix this situation so free over-the-air broadcast can continue? We have chapter and verse in our FCC filings, how many hours of news we've added to our broadcast, where we've added investigative reporters, where we've added digital reporters. I don't want to waste precious time going through those, but we are happy that our FCC filing speaks for itself to the people who really are making the decisions on this, which is the FCC.
But Rebecca, let me get back to the larger question. Is that your public interest case? Give me the affirmative case, and Eddie, you can chime in as well, please. What do you say to Craig Aaron in the second row about why your merger is in the public interest? Why should the American people support this merger? Is it just that? Because I'm not sure that's particularly persuasive.
Right. Well, because we believe that free over-the-air broadcast should be just as compelling and have just as high quality content as content that is migrating behind paywalls. And you can only do that with scale. We've talked about news. We're investing a lot in news, but there's other content that is vanishing from the free over-the-air landscape, and only scale will preserve that and bring that back. Sports is a great example. Eddie has that, but look at Shonda Rhimes announced that she's leaving ABC. Most successful African-American woman producer who's going to Netflix. So now, if you like Grey's Anatomy or any of her other shows, you're now going to have to pay $10 a month. With scale, broadcasters can keep that quality programming on free over-the-air TV because we believe it is a gem in the American communications ecosystem, and we don't want to see it become a second-class service for people who can't afford cable or who don't want to pay for cable. And you only get that in this day and age. You only get that with scale.
Okay, Andy, I want to turn to you now.
Eddie was going to chime in on
Eddie, did you want to chime in? Please, I'm sorry.
Maybe I would just pick up on the sports point, because Tribune Media has a particular role in the sports world.
Eddie, your mic.
Mike.
But we play a particular role in the world of over-the-air sports. David, I would have thought, candidly, that you would be one of the biggest cheerleaders for this merger. And the reason for that is that if you look at our portfolio, the only way to see Mets or Yankees, if you don't have the money to go to the ballpark and you aren't a cable or satellite subscriber, is on WPIX, our station in New York. If you are one of the huge number of Hispanics in Los Angeles who are over-the-air only, it's an unusually high percentage, and you want to watch the Dodgers, and you can't afford the park, or it's inconvenient, or you're not a cable or satellite subscriber, the only way to see the Dodgers in September is on KTLA in Los Angeles. The same is true in Chicago. We carry 150 major league sports events on WGN. Those are hugely expensive contracts. It's exceedingly difficult for local broadcast to compete. It's difficult for national networks to compete with over the top and with cable. But for local broadcast to compete is a virtual impossibility, but we've managed to do it.
Do you want to respond?
Go ahead.
Without deep pockets, you can't continue that, and more games are going to go behind that paywall. And the merger is a way that this, of all of the broadcasters, the one that I would say is most devoted to sports, they spent a ton of money to buy the Tennis Channel, is Sinclair. They understand that value differentiation, and I don't understand why that's not a plus.
And your suggestion that we would walk away from that we would walk away from these valuable properties that are very popular with our audience, is just silly.
Well,
Let me
Rebecca,
I just explain what a paywall is again? A paywall is basically TV for pay, okay? So you have to climb over the wall or pay whoever the gatekeeper is in order to get the programming. So
let me also
That's going to be
explain.
the acronym and
Acronym free zone.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, David.
So let me also explain why Eddie can look me in the eye and say that I, of all people, should care about the sports issues. I'm the founder and chairman of a nonprofit called Sports Fans Coalition, and when Eddie worked at the FCC, we petitioned the FCC to end the sports blackout rule that I'm proud to say in 2014 the FCC unanimously voted to end, including votes from now Chairman Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly and Commissioner Rosenworcel and Commissioner Clyburn. So, of course, I care about sports, and I care about sports being available to the public, and I care about sports being on free over-the-air TV. Now, Eddie, my beef is not with Tribune. You guys have done a great job of putting free over-the-air sports on TV. I'm glad you mentioned the Tennis Channel, though, because let me preview for you sports fans what's going to happen once Sinclair takes over. They are going to take the sports rights that they will acquire and push them onto the pay TV, the paywall properties that they have, like Stadium, like Tennis Channel, so that you will not be able to get them over the air. You will instead have to pay more to watch your local sports, which I think is a travesty. Now, I would be the first to say that sports on the air are important, but let me also remind you that the NFL claimed when we were fighting them to end that sports blackout rule that without that regulatory support, NFL games were going to come off broadcast TV, and you'd have Sports Fans Coalition to blame for it. Well, that didn't happen. When we won at the FCC, the NFL voluntarily ended its own local blackout practice. Why? Well, here's my theory why. Broadcast is still the only medium in the United States where you can reach 100% of television households. So if your advertisers include Budweiser and Coke and Pepsi and other brands that require penetration of 100%, guess what? You're still going to get broadcast advertising. And as long as local broadcast is still, and it is, the most popular place to get your local news, then guess what? You still are going to have an extremely huge audience on broadcast. So I do believe in keeping sports on the air. I don't believe this merger is the way to get it.
So, Rebecca, you're
Just
going
to
to put all the
correct
sports
David's
on the behind the so-called
Well, just to
paywall?
correct David's facts, Stadium is not behind a paywall. We are starting to roll out a broadcast component, probably on our digital subchannels, so that fact needs to be corrected. But Eddie wanted to respond to the other things.
But I don't know what basis you have for saying that they would move those sports off broadcast. And the reason they won't is that when you do retransmission consent negotiations with the big MVPDs, one of the ways that you deliver value to them and therefore get paid is by having the sports on your channel. If they move it behind the paywall, they're going to end up losing money to the MVPDs. That makes no sense.
Does that mean you would commit to not taking down that programming during a retrans dispute, or do subscribers then get the benefit of not being able to watch
Because if
you've taken it down?
If
Quick response, and I want to move on to something else.
retransmission consent negotiations, we should have another panel, Gigi,
Yes,
and
let's-
I'll
very
thank you for that.
complicated
But,
and not
but
We'll
one
bore
thing
our
we know for
audience.
sure is that
Yeah.
that is how, one of the major reasons that broadcasters do get the money they get. And so the idea that there's an incentive for Sinclair to move our broadcast games behind the paywall is, to me, makes no economic sense. And I say that as someone who's not involved in Sinclair's thinking about it, but it just, as a broadcaster, it seems totally counterintuitive.
Okay, I'm gonna
fairly
stop you
speculative.
guys there. I want to turn to Andy now, and I want to talk about something. You want to talk about a shorthand called sidecar agreements. So for years, probably 25, 30 years at this point, broadcasters have engaged in these agreements which essentially allow them to skirt local and national ownership caps through a variety of sharing agreements with other stations for staff, advertising, and sales. So in other words, a more powerful broadcaster will cut a deal with a weaker broadcaster to sell all their advertising or to, share facilities or management. And again, in my mind, if I can offer an opinion as a moderator, it's just a way to skirt the ownership rules. I want Andy to talk a little bit about what they are and why he's troubled by them. And then I'd like the broadcast folks to respond to, if we're lifting the ownership rules anyway, okay, it's going to happen tomorrow, why do we need sidecar agreements anymore, right? I can understand, although even I didn't like it, that when the rules are more restrictive, you were trying to find ways to get around them. But now that we're just saying, Katie, bar the door, we're lifting a lot of the regulations, why should there be ways to get around that as well? So, Andy, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I will exercise the privilege of responding to Jerry on one point. I personally, and I think most people, have no problem with the guidelines that the FCC had in place for many, many years that set a goal of having certain minimum amounts of news and public affairs programming for every station, although a station could demonstrate that it met the public interest in other ways. And I certainly have no problem with the 1991 Children's Television Act, which specifies that there's a minimum amount of programming has to be carried to meet the informational needs of children. And I haven't heard Jerry or anybody else challenge the constitutionality or desirability of that statute and the FCC's enforcement of it. Because, as I said at the beginning, the airwaves belong to the public and we're entitled to extract public service in exchange for the free use of the public spectrum. And that extends to the so-called sidecar agreements. This was, as Gigi said, a blatant evasion of the FCC's ownership rules through contractual arrangements that give all but actual ownership to one company while having a nominal owner in place. In fact, under the Securities Exchange Commission accounting rules, these so-called sidecar stations are generally reported as being owned by the dominant company and not by the beard, the front company in operation. My guess is that as the FCC lifts the local ownership rules, sidecars will indeed become unnecessary, and my suspicion is that in many of these instances, they have option agreements that are going to allow them to buy up the sidecar companies anyway. A sidecar is a means of having somebody who does nothing other than hold the license and goes through the motions of pretending to own and operate the station for the benefit of another company. It's a disgrace to public policy, and it makes a mockery of the law.
I want, before I turn to you, Rebecca and Eddie, I want Carmen and Jim to weigh in on these sidecar agreements as well. And just to let people know, if the Sinclair Tribune merger is consummated, there will be sidecar agreements in 63 different markets. So that's pretty significant. So
I actually calculated 35, but
okay, it's
35
still
markets.
Okay, whatever. But 35. It's still, in my opinion, evasion of the rules. But go ahead, Jim and Carmen.
With respect to sidecar agreements, NABO's position has been consistent with everything Andy said about how they are just have been used historically to evade the FCC's ownership rules. And if the FCC is about to change that ownership rule, many of these sidecar agreements do automatically have a right for the dominant broadcaster to purchase the sidecar station and take absolute control. But I do worry that if the FCC changes, because what the FCC is proposing is so far-reaching in terms of relaxing or eliminating its television ownership rules, is that you may see a station that buys out the sidecar so that it now owns two stations outright in a market, and then enters into a sidecar with a third station, because the relaxation of the rule does not prohibit another sidecar agreement after they own the two. So I think the relaxation that the FCC is contemplating has the potential for just totally destroying any local broadcast television ownership, and I think it's a very bad step that the FCC is taking.
Carmen?
So I agree with Andy and Jim. These sidecar agreements were consolidation by another name, and they just exploited the loopholes and invaded the local television ownership rules. And with this consolidation, it was less time devoted to local news and local journalism. And I agree. I think there's a real concern that this is going to undermine competition and the diversity of voices needed in local markets.
Well, first, I would direct your attention to this slide, which shows the benefits resulting from JSAs over the years. And these aren't our JSAs, they're industry-wide.
So that's joint sales agreements. Could you explain what that
Sorry,
is?
joint sales agreements are one of these agreements where two stations will combine their advertising and consolidate their ad sales force so that they can more efficiently sell their advertising and reinvest the saved costs into other broadcast operations. But this, Carmen, to respond to your point, this slide shows that in these numerous markets, actually more local news, or local news where there wasn't any local news on that smaller station before, was introduced into that marketplace as a result of the JSA. Similarly, there are non-news benefits, which are in JSA partnerships. The smaller station can get these non-news benefits. But I guess I'd just like to step back and ask the panel why the characterization that these agreements sidestep the rules if the FCC has been providing broadcasters guidance on exactly how to craft these JSAs so that they're in compliance with the rules.
And let me say this very directly. The FCC staff has been in the pocket of the broadcasting industry for 30 years. That's why.
Well, I'm just going to, I'd like to
Slander
continue
here,
on my
huh?
answer. I can't acknowledge that.
May I offer?
You asked the question.
Ever since 2008, the FCC has approved 85 JSAs, and
And every one of them should not have been approved.
well, the docket is replete with their benefits. There have never been any demonstrable harms. And in fact, just one more point, Congress actually asked the GAO to study JSAs a number of years ago. And even the GAO concluded that there was no data showing that JSAs harm the public interest or contravene the ownership rules. So it seems to me it's time to put this topic to bed. But unless...
Well, I think maybe for the people who aren't so deeply steeped in FCC lingo and lore, it's worth talking about the two ways that consolidation might take place.
Close to the mic. Yeah, just
Is
bring
it-
the mic a little closer. Ready?
Two ways the consolidation grows, potentially grows scale. One is a horizontal point, which is that there will be, the combined company would own more stations across the country and therefore cover a larger part of the country. And the question there is what percentage is okay for broadcasters to have as a kind of horizontal matter across the country in a world where many distributors now reach 100% of the country. In the old days, only broadcasters could reach mass audience. Now, obviously, the internet has changed that. The second question is kind of within each market, how many stations can you either own or have a significant relationship with, such as these so-called JSAs. And when it comes to the individual markets, it's important to remember that there are two screens that any deal has to pass. One is the Department of Justice's screen, where they look to see if the combination of stations within any given market is going to be too large. And if it is, they say you got to get rid of a station. And then there's the sort of FCC overlay, which involves its own tests and the potential for structuring deals like JSAs. I see we have the senator here, so
We have
I'll
a
stop.
special guest, and that was just perfect. I'm so delighted that Senator Blumenthal was able to join us, and I'll turn the mic over to him for a few remarks.
Well, I really apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt, and
No.
you're more than I. If you haven't finished, please do.
No. I'm sure that my words can wait, and I'm delighted that you could join.
Well, I really want to thank the Georgetown Institute for Tech Law and Policy for organizing today, and very pleased that we have this really excellent turnout for a merger that I think is profoundly important in the future of communications and media in America. Soon after Sinclair announced its proposal to acquire Tribune Media, I called on the chairman of both the Judiciary and the Commerce Committee, I sit on both, to have a hearing, to have full and complete consideration. And I am profoundly disappointed and troubled that there has been no hearing and there's no immediate prospect of one. That's not only disappointing and troubling, it's also, I think, potentially a disservice to the American public that will be affected. In fact, more than 70% of American households will be affected by an acquisition of this scope and scale. And it has even more profoundly important ramifications going forward. So there's no question that congressional scrutiny and at least one congressional hearing is necessary and appropriate, and probably more than one, because both Judiciary and Commerce have a role here. This merger very simply threatens to create a concentration of unprecedented scope and scale in the media industry in America and will unquestionably affect the public interest. Whether you're for or against it, unquestionably it will affect the public interest. So I really welcome this conversation today because it provides what I hope will be a preview of coming attractions, at the very least a prelude to what should be close and searching congressional scrutiny. And I hope that the deliberation today will really raise some of the issues that my colleagues and I have an obligation to confront. I've laid out the details about why I oppose the Sinclair proposed acquisition of Tribune in a letter that I sent on September 27, 2017, to the chairman of the FCC. I oppose this merger because it violates longstanding media ownership rules and would demonstrably harm media diversity, localism, and competition. Localism is deeply ingrained in those rules. Competition is essential in this industry, and diversity is part of our fiber in democracy. And allowing this acquisition to move forward would reflect, very bluntly and simply, a failure by the FCC to do its job. I, again, want to thank all of you for being here today, particularly the wonderful panel that you have, and hope that there will be more opportunities to air the reasons that this transaction would be a grave disservice to the American public. Again, my apologies for interrupting, and go to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
So I think the senator raised, I think, two interesting questions. Is number one, should Congress hold a hearing? But then I want to tag on a second question. Is he mentioned the Judiciary Committee, and there's been no talk. The Department of Justice has been talked a lot about lately with regard to the AT&T Time Warner merger, but it hasn't been talked about at all with regard to this merger.
Well, I just raised it.
You did.
My point.
The list of questions we got.
Right.
No,
But,
that's
no,
so-
but my point is that
I
exactly
added the
that.
question
Yeah.
this morning. I
Yeah.
apologize.
But that was that's the very point I made, and I actually think Jerry referred to it earlier as well, which is that this isn't the Wild West. You can't just willy-nilly put a whole bunch of companies together in this country, regardless of concentration and consolidation. There's some very well-established rules at the Department of Justice or guidelines around this at the Department of Justice. This merger is going to have to pass through that review. I'm not going to talk about the nature of that review because it's all confidential, but DOJ has always been rigorous about its review of broadcast mergers. It's not the first one. It's not the 10th one. They've been down this road many, many times. And so the FCC's review is a second level of review. And the question is, in addition to the concentration limits that are imposed by the Department of Justice, what more should the FCC do? And the truth is that even with the relaxed guidelines, the FCC will be doing more than the Department of Justice does. So it's not the Wild West that you could just put companies together willy-nilly. So the real question is just how strict should the rules be? And I think what Rebecca and I are trying to do is make the case that if you truly do love local broadcast, if you truly do believe in localism, if you truly do believe in serving those communities, you actually should be in favor of this deal, not opposed to it, because the resources necessary to do that in an environment that is much, much, much more competitive, and you can just go look at the balance sheets of these companies and the trend lines on their revenue, you will be drawn inescapably to that conclusion.
Yeah,
Rebecca, go ahead.
This ad revenue chart, decades ago, local broadcasters probably dominated 3/4 of that chart. But this is the declining local ad revenue situation that we're facing. I'd like to respond to some concern that the senator has. Everyone needs to understand that every broadcaster knows that if you're not local, you're not going to succeed in your market. Localism is alive and well with Sinclair Broadcast Group. I have here, I'm not going to read it all out, but I have here, this is a list of where we're number 1 or number 2 in our markets. And you don't get there unless you are meeting the needs of everyone in the community.
Okay. David, before we're going to have to close, so I do want people to address. Usually when it comes to broadcast mergers of this type, the DOJ tends to defer to the FCC, right?
Right.
And I guess I'm asking, should it play a bigger role? Obviously, it's more constrained than the FCC. It doesn't look at the public interest generally. But what role should the DOJ play here? And then just whatever else you want to respond to.
Well, I have a couple of former students in the room today, and they're all about to roll their eyes because in our class, we would talk about the various ways in which different parts of the government look at a transaction like this. Hearings on Capitol Hill, absolutely par for the course. Get it out in the public, have a debate in front of members of Congress, not because Congress decides the fate of a merger, but because Congress has oversight responsibilities over the agencies that do. Different agencies with different jurisdiction, it may sound like, redundancy, and that's because it is. Different agencies with different missions look at the same transaction, and it's no different here. Here's where I think we sort of run off the rails a little bit, though. We haven't talked a lot about a change to a rule or really an interpretation of a statute that had profound effects. There is a rule on the books that says no broadcaster can get above 39% of U.S. households. Now, I'm pretty sure, somebody can correct me if this is wrong, it's codified. This isn't something the FCC just invented. This is something in statute. With all the talk we've heard from the supporters of this merger about how the world has changed and technology has changed and competition has changed, look up there, internet, all this great stuff. What's the one thing that Chairman Pai did to that rule? He went backwards in time to before the digital transition, to when television stations used UHF signals versus VHF signals and said, that's how we're going to count households. Of course, that had the practical effect of raising the number of households you could reach through broadcast today. Now, what does that mean for the Department of Justice? Will the Department of Justice look at that and say, oh, I guess the expert agency believes that rules from 1975 about how to count households should still apply today, because I guess that's what Chairman Pai thinks. We're all about the future and all about technology when it comes to getting rid of rules, but on this one, we're going to go back in time to 1975. Will the Department of Justice look at that and say, I guess they must know more than we do about how to count households? Or will the Department of Justice say, that seems pretty backwards. Why are we talking about an analog UHF way of counting when everybody's gone digital? And we're going to look at this with fresh eyes. I hope, based on what we see at today's Department of Justice Antitrust Division, which is pretty aggressive enforcement when it comes to AT&T-Time Warner merger, I hope we see the same level of energy and enforcement when it comes to this merger, and that they disregard this rather odd regression to the 70s that Chairman Pai has chosen for counting households.
That is an unfair and Alice in Wonderland description of.
Yeah.
Mike.
Say that again. I love the Allison one.
I said that is an unfair and Alice in Wonderland description of what the chairman did. All Chairman Pai did is say that if you were going to re-examine the so-called UHF discount, which is just a way of measuring the 39%, you have to think about the 39% at the same time and think about what the public interest is. That's all he did. And that, I think, is almost inarguably correct. The 39% cap is highly antiquated in this day and age. And so if you're going to look at one, you should look at the other. And that's all he said. He said the Wheeler Commission, which had only just changed the rule a few months before, because this was on a motion for reconsideration, it wasn't even a new rulemaking, had made a mistake in deciding to undo the discount without looking at the cap itself, because the Wheeler Commission said that would take too long. And that is really not a good way to make policy. He wants to look at it holistically. That's the right way to look at it. And so he put the ball back down on the field where it was before the initial mistake was made.
Can I just ask, Eddie, I'm not sure I followed what you said, but you're smarter than me. You clerked at the Supreme Court, and I didn't. So maybe you understand something I don't. Can you just tell me, under Chairman Pai's revision of the rule, would the merged company have to divest more or fewer television stations than under the Wheeler version of the rule?
And under the change that Wheeler made, there are a whole bunch of companies that are already over the cap. So
wait, I'm asking about your transaction.
Our transaction, we would have to invest more.
Okay, that's all I need to know. Yeah. So Chairman Wheeler did something, I guess Eddie understands it better than I do, that means this merged company would have to divest fewer TV stations. That's all I need to know. In fact, I don't really understand why the change was necessary in the first place. If it was bad reasoning, then let's correct the reasoning. But it seems to me as though if we're talking about making a rule at the expert agency about how to count audience reach.
He's making a rule. He's looking at the rule about what the ultimate definition of reach ought to be. The question is not, how do you count UHF stations?
Okay.
The ultimate question is, should broadcasters in an age where everybody else gets to reach 100% of the country only get to reach 39?
That is
the real
actually.
Policy question.
Yeah,
That is
actually,
the
somebody
key
asked that question right
and Chairman
here.
Pai wants to answer that question.
Yeah.
Whereas
And
the
hopefully
Wheeler
the Department of
Commission
Justice will answer it a little
Well,
bit differently.
look, ABC, NBC, CBS all have 100% reach, not because they own their license, or they have licenses, but rather because they do that through contract with companies like mine.
So here's a question from the audience. And by the way, you guys, great questions. I wish we had time to answer all of them, but we don't. Sinclair Chair David Smith has said Sinclair is, quote, forever expanding like the universe. And if he could wish for anything, it would be complete instantaneous consolidation of the industry. Should Sinclair be allowed to own every local station? Should there be any limits? Broadcasters, and then I'd like others to fill in. Should there be
No,
any-
I'm not with the transaction
Right,
pending before the
isn't your
FCC.
argument,
I'm gonna
isn't
decline
your
to
argument
comment.
Google has 100% reach, so you should too?
I think that I really answered that question when I described the rules that are in place. The antitrust division of the Department of Justice looks at these things. There are long-established guidelines that don't allow for anything remotely like that. They'll be applied here. There are rules at the FCC that are more stringent than the Department of Justice that will also be applied here. That's a hypothetical that really doesn't exist.
Yeah, and to keep some perspective here, the proposed rule change tomorrow is not to eliminate the local ownership rules. It's just to look at them more closely on a case-by-case basis.
I have three
No,
things.
with the top four, sorry. With respect,
Number one, they're not looking at them; they're eviscerating them. You know, that's
No, I'm talking about the top four.
yeah. They're eviscerating them.
Prohibition.
They're eviscerating them. Number two, what we're talking about with the national ownership cap is something set in place by Congress. It's Congress that said 39%, and Congress is going to have to change that. Eddie is talking as if there's not a statute that precludes what they're talking about. Looking at the UHF discount in conjunction with the national ownership cap is pointless because Congress said 39%.
Well, you and I are in court over that.
And number three, you're aligning national reach. Now you're talking about national reach. All for the whole hour here, you've been talking about the importance of localism. You don't need 100% of the country to do a better job in these local communities.
Oh, I would
you
disagree
want 100%
completely.
of the country because you want to extract more programming rents. And if you want to reach 100% of the country like ABC, start a network.
I want Rebecca to respond, but I mentioned the ultra high frequency UHF discount early on, and I think it's worth it for maybe Carmen. You can just take 2 minutes to explain why was there a UHF discount. I will tell you, I'm old, right? So when I was a kid, if you wanted channels 1 to 13, there was no remote control. You clicked in. If you wanted, what was it, 14 to 69, you'd have to tune it like a radio. Those were UHF stations, and they were at a severe disadvantage, and nobody watched them. Some of the programming was so awful, it was unbelievable, right? And that's why there was a UHF discount, to encourage folks to buy these kind of less than optimal stations. Of course, I said, Carmen, you explain it, and I'm doing it. But so that's why there was the discount. But once we went to the digital TV transition in, 2009, that disadvantage went away. And that's why we got rid of the UHF discount when I was working for Tom Wheeler. So to me, it's the height of hypocrisy for a deregulator to reinstate a rule that has absolutely no basis in reality, especially a chairman who likes to say you have to take the facts as they are, not as you wish them to be.
Well,
go ahead, Rebecca. Now you can respond.
As I understand it, he wants to have that conversation of, in reality, what is the right number? Why is it 39%? I think the proceeding that he has said he wants to open is to start that dialogue, and create a record and get public input and look at today's advertising marketplace or consolidation marketplace and ask ourselves, after decades, is this the right number? I'm not afraid of having that dialogue. We welcome it, and it's easier to have that dialogue in an agency that is set up to have public input than you can in Congress.
Carmen?
So thank you, Gigi, for explaining the UHF discount.
I'm very passionate about it.
No, and what I want to make a point of is that exactly what you said, there's no technological justification for it. And I think everyone here agrees with that. And you're making a procedural argument of the way we should consider it. But even when you put Sinclair and Tribune together, you would be 6.5% over the 39% cap that currently exists and is in Congress. And that's a congressional
Well, when you put
statute.
them together, when you put them together, and I'm sure that before the deal is complete, they will have to come into compliance with the cap rule, which, as you say, the current under the current rule, the combination with no divestitures is over. They've already said in their filings they will come into compliance with the rule. But this argument that because a rule, in your view, is obsolete technologically, and there are people who take the other side from that, but I'll just leave that aside, should be undone without looking at the fabric of the regulation that it's a part of, it makes no sense. When you undo the UHF discount, you are immediately, as an effect, massively constricting the ability for a group of companies to consolidate. Consolidate, I guess, has a bad name to it, but that's what you do. And you're not then looking at the overarching rule of what number should be the right number, 39%, however you count it. Is that the right number, or should be 100, should be 80, should be 60? Whatever that is, the idea that you should just pull that one thread without looking at the picture of the market structure. I mean, Reed Hundt, Democratic former chair of the FCC, when I got into the chief of staff's job, he took me to dinner and he said one thing to me. He said, I have one piece of advice for you, which is everything in the world is about market structure. You must think about market structure, or if you don't think about market structure, industries that count on the government to do the right thing are going to suffer terribly. All Chairman Pai is basically saying is we should look at this in an overarching market structure sense to understand where the broadcast business is today in terms of the appropriate level of consolidation. How that is objectionable, I don't understand. And that is wholly apart from the concerns that you expressed, Carmen, which are very, very real concerns, and you too, Jim, about we do have a terrible problem with diversity ownership in media today. It's very widespread. It's not just limited to media, as of course you know. And How to solve that problem is one of the thorniest things that the FCC ever deals with. I will say, while I was there, I don't think we were at all successful in moving the ball, and because it's really, really hard. But taking a sort of manipulating the consolidation rules for companies that are in an industry that is hurting as a way of sort of forcing diversity, to me, is the wrong way to think about that problem. We have to solve it, but we have to solve it in ways that I think are more with a scalpel than with a sledgehammer like that.
By the way, I will agree with one thing Rebecca said, because I have to try to agree with you on something. I think that the minority tax credit was extremely successful.
Exactly.
That I think
Could you
our friends.
explain what the minority tax credit
Well, sure. I mean, you can't buy a TV station or anything expensive, really, if you don't have credit, if there isn't a banker or a lender or an investor behind you. So how do you make an investment attractive? One way is you give that investor a tax break and what we would call a transferable one, one that could be traded.
Yes.
And Eddie, you guys should stop me if I'm
No.
or Jim, you guys should just stop me. What Congress did was change the tax code such that somebody who did lend to or sell to, in this case, sell to,
Yes.
a minority owner got a tax
That's correct.
benefit. Now, under the Adirondack decision from the Supreme Court, we, as a country, are far more limited in our ability to do race-specific incentives. And I think that's a shame, because all you have to do is look out the window and see that we haven't quite gotten there yet. But that is the law of the land, and that is what we must deal with. Nothing, I would argue, Rebecca, stops your company from voluntarily doing this, and I hope when you are forced to divest stations, and I hope you're forced to divest a lot, you announce that those stations are going to be sold to people who have not been in the business before, and maybe that's one way to address diversity in the marketplace.
And there's a really essential point that we haven't quite closed the circle on that I have to explain that's really essential here. If you talk about the value of the tax certificate policy and the ability to spin off stations, the success of the tax certificate policy was because the FCC had rules that required limits that required divestitures to take place. Right. And if Chairman Pai lifts the ownership rules so that Sinclair can acquire all the Tribune stations without having to divest any stations, there are no stations that are going to be spun off. And as Jim said at the beginning, if there's going to be any value to this transaction, it would be the spin-off of stations. But if the FCC lifts the rules so that no stations have to be spun off, and if the FCC lifts the rules so that large, deep-pocketed companies like Nexstar and Sinclair and Tegna can buy up all the stations, it's fewer opportunities for new entrants, many of whom are going to be potentially minorities and women, to buy stations at all. So there's a direct link between changing these ownership rules and the opportunities for entry for new owners who are minorities and women. And finally, I have to say, for Eddie Lazarus to talk about the FCC manipulating the ownership rules for Sinclair and Tribune, who have gamed the system with sidecar cars, having Sinclair sidecar stations owned by the elderly mother of the CEO of Sinclair, who was nominally a different independent company, takes a lot of chutzpah.
Okay, hold on. Before Eddie, I'll let you respond. But I wanted to see if Jim wanted to add anything there.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything that Andy just said.
Even the chutzpah part?
Well, I won't respond on that part. But it is a problem when you look at what they're doing in terms of eliminating these rules. As Andy said, in recent years, because of court decisions and congressional action or inaction, the minority ownership policy has been largely ineffective, and all we've been able to do is get some spinoffs from some of these large mergers. So if you eliminate the rules which require these spinoffs, then you do make it virtually impossible for us to see any significant growth coming up in minority ownership.
Okay, I'll let Eddie and Rebecca have the last word on this, and then there are two really good questions I want to ask after that, and then we'll close.
No, I will pass responding, Andy, other than just to say that we actually don't have any JSAs at Tribune, so I take personal umbrage on behalf of the company.
Okay. All right, why don't we go to the next question then? What would the impact of the merger be on political campaigns and election, given Sinclair's, what they call must-run, corporate directives and known right-wing views? And I might also, I'll let you guys answer that, but also say to some of the others on the panel, is this really just about the fact that Sinclair has been purported to want to start a, broadcast Fox?
No.
Is this really about their political views as opposed to the problem with the size? But go ahead, Rebecca, answer the main question. What would it be on political campaigns, given the must-runs? And
I don't
explain
think
what the
there's
must-runs
no
are.
impact. There's no impact whatsoever. I think what Gigi is referring to is, are you talking about our what we do have our National News Bureau or the commentary?
Yeah, well, both, right?
Well,
I mean, go ahead. Could you explain
we
what
launched
it is?
a National News Bureau that we're very, very proud of. We have, like many station groups, we have a National Bureau where we cover national stories and we share them with our stations. These are completely objective news stories without any opinion in them. So to answer your question, there will be no impact whatsoever on elections with respect to what we air. With respect to our news. If you're referring to some short commentaries that we run, that is a tiny fraction of what we run at various different times on our stations. They are the opinions of one person. They don't reflect the opinions of the 9,000 people that work at Sinclair, and I don't think it's going to have any impact on the concern that you're describing.
May I?
But, yes.
May I please?
And just explain, when we're talking about must-runs, these are segments that Sinclair stations are required to air. So there's no editorial judgment able to be exercised by whoever runs those stations.
I want to say this as a card-carrying, flamingly progressive Democrat. My opposition to this merger does not stem from the fact that there are conservative views expressed, any more than the opposition of all the conservatives against this merger stem from the conservative views of the broadcaster. I mean, you wouldn't have Newsmax and One American News and The Blaze publicly opposing this merger if they were somehow against conservative views being put on the airwaves. What we're against is the power. The power. And yes, elections will be affected by that power. Who gets to buy ads? Who doesn't? Why was it that David Smith and Sinclair broke their network affiliate relationship, the contract, by not airing a story about Iraq war dead, eliciting a letter from Senator John McCain saying that's unpatriotic? Why? Because they didn't want that viewpoint getting out, and that's the point. That's power. So it's not about what view is being espoused. There are plenty of conservatives against this merger. It's how much power is being amassed under one roof.
Point of personal privilege. First of all, I agree with David. I don't care about Sinclair's conservative politics. I care that Sinclair should have the ability to deliver any brand of politics, progressive or conservative, to 72% of the country. But Eddie said that Tribune doesn't have JSAs. Technically, I suppose that's correct. It has a sidecar company called Dreamcatcher that has SSAs. If you want me to explain the difference, there isn't any.
Right. There is a very big difference, but we can leave that aside.
Yeah, we're out of time. That'll be for the next panel, but go ahead, Eddie.
But just on that point, the reason we have SSAs in two very small markets.
Those are shared service agreements.
Right, which are different, but in any event, it doesn't make any difference.
Similar.
It doesn't make any difference. The reason we have them is because of the incredibly arcane rule that you can't own a newspaper and a television station in the same market.
So you evaded the rules with a contractual agreement, which is exactly what we've been talking about.
The FCC passed on all of this. You say they evaded the rules. The rule maker decided we didn't evade the rules. They said we were in compliance with the rules, Andy. Not the rules that you want, but the rules that are actually in place. But
the rules that would benefit the public.
Andy, here's the problem.
As defined by Andy
You've defended the newspaper cross-ownership rule till newspapers were put out of business. It's the same process. The newspapers were desperate for revenue. They wanted relief from ridiculous old rules around owning both a station and a newspaper in the same market where you could actually share a news bureau and save money and actually serve the community better. But well-meaning people decided that's too dangerous, it's too big an accumulation of power. And as a result, in community after community after community in this country, local newspapers are failing. And that's an unfortunate fact.
I'll just say you're wrong. We don't have time for me to explain why.
Okay, one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. And thanks to everybody for staying for so long. This was, and thank you, panelists. Fantastic conversation. So the last question, and I'm sorry I can't get to them all, and they're really great. If antitrust laws are all we need to regulate broadcasters, then shouldn't we also get rid of other regulations that distort the market, such as must carry? I think that's we're coming back to kind of where we started from, right? So, again, if we're going to say, let's get rid of the FCC, broadcasters are not the only industry that wants to get rid of the FCC, let antitrust rules rule, let the free market rule, why should broadcasters have benefits like must carry and even, frankly, retransmission consent? Go ahead. Which is, by the way, is codified in law.
Well, I guess I would just quickly say the reason retransmission consent is so important is because, as we've shown, our declining revenue is not sufficient to support the very things that everyone on this panel has said that they want us to do and that they want American communities to have. So retrans, while our advertising is the most important revenue stream for us, we can't do it without retrans. So if you care about free and local broadcast, you're going to have to find a way to supplement our way of financing it without a dime from the government, I should add. And retrans has been the proven and I think most fair way to do that.
I guess I would just say that if you're asking whether, given the fact that there hasn't been a major rewrite of the telecom laws since 1996, whether this is an area in general that is ripe for Congress to take a look at and think about what the rules ought to be now that we have ubiquitous high-speed broadband and a whole bunch of other questions, I think my answer would be yes. I don't think what you should do is take some teeny corner of the media world and distort that particular piece by looking only at what might be outmoded laws or regulations in that one area. It is absolutely time for another rewrite of the Telecom Act. But the trouble is, it's really, really hard to do big legislation, as all of us in this room are painfully aware. And so a lot of it gets pushed down to the regulatory agencies. And we battle it out, and a lot of the battles are over money. Some are over other things, but it's all very, very hard, and that's what makes for debates like today's.
To Eddie's point,
Go ahead.
as a footnote,
We don't want to go down the road.
the ecosystem that broadcasters exist in is very complicated, and it involves property, private property, intellectual property that has jurisdiction in the copyright laws, in the broadcast laws, and that integration, if you peel apart just must carry or just retransmission consent, without addressing the overall issue of property and how program providers are compensated for their effort and for their intellectual property, that would be a disservice to the entire industry. You'd have to do it sort of holistically all at once, and that's very hard to do, as Eddie points out. But you'd want to do it in a broad sort of white paper look at how we should regulate content and private property rights.
So let's have Carmen, Jim, Andy, and David, and then we'll close it out.
Sure. So just one quick point, and I think, I do agree with you. Maybe we should take a holistic approach. But what I would like to see is having some studies about the impact that this will have on diversity, especially ownership for women and people of color. And I think we need to understand the impact that change will have before we move forward with any changes at all.
And I would concur with Carmen. I think where we are is that the FCC is allowing, if they adopt the rule changes they're proposing for tomorrow, they're going to allow wholesale consolidation of the industry without having any consideration of what it means for diversity. So if all we can look to from the FCC is perhaps a couple of spin-offs when we have consolidation on this level, that's going to be inadequate, and the kind of decrease of minority ownership we're seeing in the broadcast industry is going to continue.
I've said enough. I rest my case.
David, last word.
Well, we started off by talking about why broadcast is different. Some of us believe that it isn't, that it's just one of many sources of information along with the internet and maybe something that gets invented next year that we've never heard of. Others of us believe that it has some unique properties, like the fact that there's government public taxpayer support, or the fact that local news is still, over broadcast, local news is still the most popular way to get your information. But make no mistake, what goes on at the FCC tomorrow, and when we talk about these rules, this is not an abstract academic question. There's a real transaction with real implications waiting to be consummated, and it's going to have an impact on all of our lives, and we better be ready for it.
Well, thank you, panelists. This is fantastic. Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you. Have a great afternoon.